Are you looking to run your own security guard training school? Check out guardcardtraining.com. We have state-approved security guard training materials, professionally printed and bound student manuals, PowerPoint presentations, knowledge checks, and final exams. Everything you need to run your own program. Just open the box and start teaching. guardcardtraining.com. Welcome to Episode 9 of the Security Professionals Podcast, Workplace Violence. Welcome to the Security Professionals Podcast, brought to you by Security Training Center, LLC. This is your weekly source of news, tips, and education for the security specialist. I'm your host, Alex Haddix, and this is Episode 9, Workplace Violence. This week, we're going to scratch the surface on workplace violence. This is a large and diverse topic. The media loves to cover workplace violence in terms of shootings, but those only represent a small portion of workplace violence. The sensational shooting reports made by the media represent only 0.1% of the total workplace violence incidents. 0.1% is 1 per 1,000 incidents. But as they say in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. There also have been some recent pushes to include workplace bullying in the workplace violence category. Haven't heard of workplace bullying? It's starting to make the human resources lists. There have even been bills proposed to include workplace violence bullying in the harassment category. Many of the advocacy groups equate workplace bullying to domestic violence because they have similar dominance patterns and psychological damage. The relationship can be supervisor to subordinate or coworker to coworker. If you think long enough about it, you can see how workplace bullying could even eventually trigger a workplace violence incident. So under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, employers are liable for injuries as a result of violence if they fail to provide proper emergency plans. However, there are categories of employment where violence or potential injury and illness are accepted as part of the job. Some of those categories include the military, firefighters, police, hospital employees, and security guards are some of those exceptions. This does not excuse the employer from providing as safe an environment as possible. Classes in violence prevention are one type of program to limit the possibility of injury due to violence. 29 U.S.C. Section 659, Subsection 5, Subsection A, each employer, 1, shall furnish to each of his employees employment and place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious bodily harm to his employees. Any workplace has a potential for violence. From employees who react poorly to disciplinary actions, customers who felt they have been wronged by the establishment to robbery and theft, the security professional is usually thrust into the middle of the confrontation. The FBI has created categories for the different types of workplace violence, and there are 4 broad categories. Type 1 is criminal intent. The perpetrator has no legitimate relationship to the business or the employees. Crimes include robbery, shoplifting, and trespassing. The vast majority of homicides, 85%, fall into this category. Type 1 represents nearly 80% of workplace homicides. The groups that are most vulnerable to this type of violent crime are taxi drivers, late-night retailers, those who are on duty at night, work in isolated locations, and who work in dangerous neighborhoods. Type 2 is a customer-client relationship. The perpetrator has a legitimate relationship with the victim while being served by the business. This includes students, patients, and clients. A large number of incidents occur in the field of security since the security guard may be called upon to defuse a potentially violent interaction. Type 3 is worker on worker. The perpetrator is an individual who has legitimate business at the facility or business who attacks or threatens another individual who also is legitimately associated with the business. This type of violence accounts for 7% of all fatalities in the workplace. School shootings fall into this category. Type 4 is a personal relationship. The perpetrator generally has no interest in the business, although he or she has some personal relationship with the victim. This category includes victims of domestic violence, being assaulted or threatened at the worksite. Homicide is the second leading cause of fatal occupational injuries for all workers and is the leading cause of fatal occupational injuries for women. This is when a violent spouse, domestic abuser, comes to the workplace to continue to abuse the spouse. Now going back, type 2 is most commonly customers assaulting employees or service providers. And the two greatest categories for this are healthcare and security. And type 3 and 4 can affect anyone employed at the location. So let's move on to the confrontational aspect. No one likes confrontation. It's uncomfortable, unpleasant, and anxiety-producing. Most people will do everything they can to avoid conflict. Unfortunately, it is sometimes the best intervention. Whether an individual enters into the confrontation willingly or it's thrust upon a person, there are several consistent reactions that individuals experience. Psychologists refer to this autonomic nervous response as the fight or flight response. With an untrained individual in the flight mode, panic is often the result. In that state, several things occur. Physically, breathing is affected. It becomes shallow, reducing the oxygen intake. The body releases adrenaline into the system, which can be detrimental. Adrenaline affects our vision, causing tunnel vision, a narrow and focused view. This allows us to focus on the immediate conflict, but causes some loss of peripheral vision and awareness. Adrenaline also reduces fine motor control. Physical strength and speed can increase, but it will be nearly impossible to thread a needle. Part of that fine motor control includes the ability to speak effectively. Often, speech can be slightly slurred under times of stress. Along with a loss of fine motor control, muscles can shake. Then there's also the emotional response to the confrontational. Rational thought is negatively affected by confrontation. Emotional thinking becomes the primary process, and crying or laughing hysterically are not uncommon. As an individual becomes more involved with a potential crisis, nearing panic, the less effective that person will be in containing behavior and resolving the issue. Now, everything discussed here are normal reactions and to be expected of an untrained individual. These responses are discussed during the self-evaluation and awareness lesson that we include in our training. By knowing oneself and the individual reactions in a confrontation, an individual can be prepared to react appropriately. This is the premise behind all training. When one is trained in the appropriate responses in a given situation, the training becomes the method of operation rather than panic. It's training, training, and training. Individuals should train repeatedly, not because an event is expected, but rather in case the event occurs. Training topics are identified because someone, somewhere historically, was confronted with an unfamiliar circumstance, and the response caused further problems. So you need to train as if you're responding to the actual situation. Do not think of the training as an exercise without consequences, because when it comes down to it and you feel those responses for the first time, you're not going to be able to respond appropriately. You're going to panic. Training, good, consistent, reality-based training, prevents the panic, and the security officer can react appropriately. Now let's take a look at the stress models. There are 5 stages to the stress model. Now picture this model as a classic bell curve. So starting on the left is stage 1, the initiation. From a baseline, an encounter of some type in which an issue is the beginning of an escalation situation. The triggering event may or may not be known by either party. At other times, it can be really apparent. Stage 2, which is moving up the curve, is the escalation. These are subsequent events when the individual's behavior becomes more pronounced. This is when adrenaline increases and the interactions begin to show signs of possible crisis. The goal is to resolve the conflict at this stage, stage 2, whenever possible. Stage 3 is crisis. This is the peak of the event, the top of the bell curve. When we reach this stage, the individual is out of control and verbally or physically assaultive. The situation is at its most critical state, and if not handled appropriately, the likelihood of injury is high. Stage 4 is when we start to move down the curve towards resolution. Stage 4 is resolution. The crisis has passed, and the involved individual generally feels some remorse for the actions displayed. All parties are generally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. Stage 5 is recovery. The situation and the individuals have returned to their baseline levels. If a criminal complaint has been issued, the perpetrator is generally under arrest. Now we're going to take a look at some mistakes, some very common mistakes made during an incident. People can make several common mistakes as the situation escalates. When mistakes are made, the situation becomes out of control, and the encounter can be described as a lose-lose situation. No one wins since one or both people are injured or arrested. A common mistake is overreaction. Now, overreaction occurs in 3 common responses: fear or panic, anger, or frustration. It's a process of escalating one's own behaviors physically to an unnecessary level when confronted. Unless the individual is physically assaulted, this response is totally inappropriate. The risk involved in overreaction is that the other people are more likely to be injured. The most likely person to be injured is the individual causing the crisis because the reacting individual, in this case the private security officer, fears for their personal safety and preemptively strikes. Now, alternatively, an underreaction is also problematic. People can become incapacitated or pull inward in the hopes that the aggressor will just go away. This is seen as a nonverbal sign of weakness by the aggressor and potentially leads to additional aggression as it's interpreted as being ignored. So underreaction can also lead to injury. However, in this instance, the injured individual is often the staff member. The aggressor strikes out in anger or frustration, and unless trained, the staff member fails to react in a timely manner and is injured. In short, underreacting is as bad as overreacting. So as previously mentioned, training and practice are key elements to a professional response. Training and role-playing exercises can reduce the risk of errors during a confrontation. So let's dig a little bit more into the importance of practice. And this cannot be stressed enough. You need to practice. All skills are perishable, meaning that if the time is not taken to practice, skills will be forgotten or diminished. So consider playing a musical instrument as a child, and you get to be quite good at it. As the interest wanes, say you go to high school and you get involved in other stuff, and you put the instrument away. Now you're an adult, and you try to pick up the instrument again and try and play it. And the operative word here is tries, because those skills that you learned as a child are gone. I mean, I played piano as a child, and as an adult, I can't even play chopsticks. So here are some statistics. And these are from 2008 and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is the main federal agency charged with the enforcement of safety and health legislation. They reported that 33 out of every 1,000 employees would be assaulted yearly in the retail environment. This includes verbal threats, but it shows the prevalence of aggression. So in a large corporation of, say, 300,000 employees, that's over 11,000 employees per year being assaulted. Now, being the victim of assault is a very real possibility. Assaults can and do happen. So you need to take these self-protective classes, including crisis intervention techniques, and practice them. And practice and practice. If I say practice them, I meant practice them. And you need to become effective at conflict resolution and minimizing injury. So now let's take a look at the role of security. Now, the specific role of security in a workplace violence incident should be governed by the post orders and standard operating procedures established by the employer and the client. What we're talking about in this episode are generalized best practices, but they should not supersede orders from the employer or client. Always follow the post orders. And where those post orders are in conflict with what we have here in the show, proceed with the post orders. So security may be called to respond to or deter acts of workplace violence. Now, for example, security is often called to a scene where an employee or management suspects a violent situation may arise. The security officer is a show of force and a visual deterrent to violence. The security guard should not speak or intercede unless directed by management or when an act of violence is evident. In these situations, management is the designated team leader. Security officers should not respond to the employee acting out, even if comments and threats are directed specifically at the security officers. Now, here are some common scenarios. There are numerous common scenarios where violence may erupt. Here are a couple of examples. Employee termination, disciplinary actions, a disgruntled former employee showing back up on campus, an intoxicated employee at the workplace, and sometimes just general stress. The goal is always to diffuse a potential situation and prevent it from reaching crisis. Again, we want to stop it at stage 2, escalation. We don't want it to go beyond that point. Violence and physical containment should be avoided whenever possible. Laying hands on an employee, a client, or customer is an absolute tool of last resort. If it comes to that, use only a reasonable amount of force to contain the violent outburst. A reasonable force is defined as the amount of force necessary to protect oneself or one's property from an ongoing assault. Now, for example, yelling leading to forced restraint is excessive, so don't do that. Ignoring inappropriate verbalizations, like cursing, swearing, things like that, and remaining calm is the appropriate and proper response to that scenario. The last thing I'm going to cover is the critical incident stress debriefing. This is the after-action or after-event meeting. It's critical that after every incident, the team leader and a supervisor discuss the following items with the individual or team. The positive behaviors of the staff should be reinforced while all are present. Do not be negative during the meeting. This is important for team morale and cohesion. Keep things positive. The leader should review the items that can be improved from a global perspective. Do not call out individuals for failings during the incident. However, if an individual performs at an exceptional level, that person should be encouraged during the briefing. Because trust me, when somebody does something wrong during an incident, everybody knows, and there is no reason to beat a dead horse. If an individual does perform poorly during the incident, it should be discussed privately. It is a bad managerial practice to shame an individual in public. And that's it. I'm going to call the episode there. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a huge topic, and there are entire books written on just this subject. This was just a brief introduction to the subject and some strategies to deal with an event. Well, that will do it for this episode of the Security Professionals Podcast. If you have any tips you'd like to share with everyone, a comment on a show, or if you would like to suggest a topic for an upcoming episode, write into podcast@security-training-center.com. Or you can leave us a voicemail at 909-742-0649. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe.
Joel Klein catches a 7 o'clock train after his evening CPR class at the American Red Cross.
Ron Garrett is on the same train. He's had a rough day and doesn't feel like himself. Until he feels the sudden tightness in his chest, Ron never thought he'd actually have a heart attack.
Until Joel is administering CPR, he never thought he'd actually save a life.
When you train with the Red Cross, you change a life.
Starting with your own.
Call 1-800-RED-CROSS or visit redcross.org to learn about life-changing opportunities in your area.
The Security Professionals Podcast is copyright Security Training Center, LLC. This work is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. An archive of previous episodes can be found at security-training-center.com/podcast.